Aria Thompson sat in the back row of the municipal courthouse, her eyes focused on the witness stand where a police officer was giving his testimony. She wore simple civilian clothes, dark jeans, a plain sweater, and boots that looked ordinary, but were designed for quick movement if needed. To everyone else in the courtroom, she looked like just another concerned citizen. Nobody knew about the classified operations she'd completed overseas. Nobody knew about the medals hidden in a box in her apartment closet. Nobody knew that she could take down an armed opponent in under 10 seconds without making a sound. She was here for Rebecca, a woman she'd met at the community center where Aria volunteered teaching self-defense classes. Rebecca's husband had been beating her for months, and tonight was supposed to be the night justice was finally served. Officer Castellanos was on the witness stand, his uniform crisp and his voice confident. He was describing the night he'd responded to a domestic disturbance call at Rebecca's apartment 3 weeks ago. "When I arrived at the scene," Castellanos said, looking directly at the jury, "I found the defendant arguing with his wife. There were raised voices but no evidence of physical violence. I advised both parties to separate for the evening and cool down." Aria felt her jaw tighten. That wasn't what had happened at all. She had been there that night. Not officially. She'd just been dropping off some groceries for Rebecca when she heard the screaming from inside the apartment. When she'd run upstairs, she'd found Rebecca's husband, Tony, standing over her with his fist raised. Rebecca was on the floor, blood trickling from her nose, trying to shield herself with her arms. Aria had stepped between them immediately. Years of military training had kicked in, and she'd positioned herself in a way that made it clear Tony needed to back down. He was drunk and angry, but he wasn't stupid enough to take on someone who moved with Aria's confidence. "You need to leave," she'd told Tony in a voice that left no room for argument. "Now." Tony had stumbled toward the door, muttering threats under his breath. That's when Officer Castellanos had arrived. But instead of checking on Rebecca or pursuing Tony, he'd seemed more interested in getting the situation to disappear quietly. Aria remembered watching from the kitchen doorway as Castellanos talked to Tony in the hallway. She couldn't hear everything they said, but she caught enough words to understand what was happening. Castellanos was giving Tony advice on how to avoid charges. "Keep it down next time," she'd heard him say. "Neighbors complain too much around here." When Castellanos finally came inside to talk to Rebecca, his questions were clearly designed to minimize what had happened. He kept asking if she was sure she wanted to press charges, if she understood how difficult the legal process would be, if she thought maybe this was just a misunderstanding that got out of hand. Rebecca, still shaken and bleeding, had looked to Aria for support. That's when Aria had stepped forward and offered to give a statement about what she'd witnessed. Castellanos had looked annoyed. "That won't be necessary," he'd said quickly. "This is a family matter. Best to let them work it out themselves." But Rebecca had found the courage to insist on pressing charges anyway. And now, 3 weeks later, Castellanos was lying under oath about what had happened that night. "Officer Castellanos," the prosecutor continued, "did you observe any signs of physical violence during your response to this domestic disturbance?" "No, I did not," Castellanos replied without hesitation. Mrs. Patterson appeared upset, but there were no visible injuries or evidence of assault. Aria's hands clenched in her lap. She remembered clearly helping Rebecca clean blood from her face while they waited for the paramedics. She remembered the bruises on Rebecca's arms that were already starting to form. She remembered taking photos with her phone to document the injuries, though Rebecca had been too scared to use them at the time. The defense attorney stood up for cross-examination. "Officer Castellanos, in your professional opinion, was this a serious domestic violence incident or more of a verbal disagreement that got heated?" "Based on my observations," Castellanos said, "I would classify it as a minor domestic dispute. No weapons were involved, no serious injuries occurred, and both parties were cooperative with my instructions to separate for the evening." Aria felt sick listening to the lies. She glanced at Rebecca, who was sitting in the front row with her lawyer. Rebecca's shoulders were shaking, and she kept dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. She looked small and defeated, like she was already expecting to lose. Tony sat at the defendant's table looking smug and confident. He kept glancing back at Rebecca with the expression that clearly said he thought he was going to get away with everything. When Castellanos finished his testimony and stepped down from the witness stand, he walked past Aria's row. For just a moment, their eyes met. She saw him register her presence, and something flickered across his face. Recognition, maybe, or annoyance that she was there. During the lunch break, Aria approached Rebecca's lawyer in the hallway outside the courtroom. Attorney Johnson was a middle-aged woman who specialized in domestic violence cases, and she looked frustrated. "The police report doesn't match what Rebecca told me happened," Johnson said quietly. "And without corroborating testimony, it's going to be very difficult to prove her case." "I was there that night," Aria said. "I saw everything." Johnson's eyes lit up. "You're willing to testify?" "Absolutely. Officer Castellanos is lying about what happened, and I can prove it." "What exactly did you see?" Aria described the scene in detail. Tony standing over Rebecca with his fist raised, the blood on Rebecca's face, the bruises forming on her arms. She also told Johnson about overhearing Castellanos' conversation with Tony in the hallway. "This could change everything," Johnson said. "But I have to warn you, challenging a police officer's testimony isn't easy. The defense will try to discredit you, and some jury members automatically believe police over civilians." "I can handle it," Aria said simply. Johnson studied her for a moment. There was something about Aria's calm confidence that suggested she'd faced worse situations than a hostile courtroom. "Okay. I'll file a motion to reopen testimony. We should be able to get you on the stand this afternoon." As they walked back into the courtroom, Aria noticed Officer Castellanos standing near the back doors. He was talking quietly with another officer, but his eyes were on her. When he realized she was looking back, he quickly turned away, but not before she saw the expression on his face. It was the look of someone who had just realized he might have a problem. The afternoon session began with Johnson's motion to call an additional witness. The judge granted the request over the defense attorney's objections, and Aria was sworn in. She testified clearly and calmly about everything she had witnessed that night. She described Tony's aggressive behavior, Rebecca's injuries, and most importantly, Castellanos' conversation with Tony in the hallway. "You're saying Officer Castellanos told the defendant to keep it down next time?" the prosecutor asked. "Yes. He also said that neighbors complained too much. It was clear he was advising the defendant on how to avoid getting caught in the future." The defense attorney tried his best to discredit her testimony, suggesting she might have misheard or misunderstood the conversation. But Aria's military training had taught her to observe and remember details under pressure. Her testimony was precise and unshakable. When she finished and stepped down from the witness stand, she could see the impact her words had made on the jury. Several of them were looking at Castellanos with new suspicion, but it was Castellanos himself who concerned her most. As she walked past him on her way back to her seat, he leaned close enough to whisper, "You just made a big mistake, lady." The threat was quiet enough that nobody else heard it, but the message was clear. By challenging his testimony, she had made an enemy. Aria took her seat and watched the rest of the proceedings with growing unease. She'd accomplished what she came here to do. Rebecca's case was now much stronger, and Tony would probably be convicted. But she couldn't shake the feeling that her real problems were just beginning. Aria thought the courthouse incident was over. She was wrong. 3 days later, she was driving home from her evening run when red and blue lights flashed in her rearview mirror. Her heart sank as she recognized the patrol car. It was Officer Castellanos. She pulled over carefully, keeping her hands visible on the steering wheel. Years of military training had taught her to stay calm under pressure, but this felt different. This felt personal. Castellanos approached her window with a swagger that made her skin crawl. Well, if it isn't our concerned citizen," he said, his voice dripping with fake politeness. "Do you know why I stopped you?" Aria kept her voice steady. "No, officer. I was driving the speed limit. Broken taillight," he said, tapping the back of her car with his flashlight. "That's a safety violation." Aria knew her car was in perfect condition. She'd checked it that morning like she always did. I had it inspected last week. Everything was working fine. Castellanos walked around to the back of her car and shined his light on the taillight. From her side mirror, Arya could see him clearly. The light was working perfectly. "Looks like it's working now," he said when he returned. "Must have been loose. I'll let you off with a warning this time, but you better keep an eye on that." He handed back her license and registration, letting his fingers brush against hers longer than necessary. "Drive safe now. These roads can be dangerous for someone like you." The threat was clear, even though his words sounded harmless. Arya waited until he drove away before starting her car again. Her hands were shaking slightly, and that made her angry. She hadn't survived 3 tours overseas to be intimidated by one corrupt cop. The next morning, she drove to work at the community center where she volunteered teaching self-defense classes. Again, the red and blue lights appeared behind her. Again, it was Castellanos. This time he claimed she was speeding. The speed limit was 35 and her dashboard showed she was going 32. She pointed this out politely. "Radar doesn't lie," he said, even though she could see no radar equipment in his car. "But since you seem like a law-abiding citizen, I'll give you another warning." He took his time checking her license, calling it in on his radio. She could hear him asking the dispatcher to run a full background check. When it came back clean, she saw the frustration flash across his face. "You know," he said, leaning against her car, "it's interesting how someone with such a clean record suddenly shows up at court questioning police testimony. Makes a person wonder what you're really up to." Arya met his eyes in the mirror. "I was supporting a friend. That's what good people do." "Good people," he repeated with a sneer. "Well, good people follow the rules. They don't go around causing trouble for hard-working officers." After he left, Arya sat in her car for 5 minutes, thinking. This wasn't random. This was targeted harassment, and it was going to get worse. She was right. Over the next 2 weeks, Castellanos seemed to appear everywhere she went. When she stopped for groceries, his patrol car was in the parking lot. When she went to the gym, he drove by slowly, making sure she saw him. When she met friends for coffee, he would walk past the window, staring inside. He pulled her over 6 more times. Once for suspicious driving patterns when she took a different route home to avoid construction. Once for failure to signal when she had clearly used her turn signal. Once for having an air freshener hanging from her rearview mirror, which he claimed was obstructing her view. Each stop followed the same pattern. He would approach with that fake politeness, find some excuse to detain her, run her license through the system, and act frustrated when nothing criminal came up. He always ended with some veiled threat about staying out of police business. Arya started documenting everything. She used her phone to record their interactions when possible, though she was careful to be discreet about it. She wrote down times, dates, locations, and what was said. Her military training had taught her that intelligence gathering was crucial for any successful operation. She also started noticing things about Castellanos that he probably didn't realize she was picking up on, the way he kept checking his phone during stops like he was expecting important messages. The small notebook he carried that he would glance at before approaching her car, as if he was following a script. The fact that he always worked alone, during these incidents, never with a partner. Most telling of all was his increasing agitation when her background checks kept coming back clean. She could see him getting more frustrated each time the dispatcher confirmed she had no warrants, no arrests, no record of any kind. What Castellanos didn't know was that Arya's military service was classified. Her real background was buried so deep that only people with the highest security clearances could access it. To local law enforcement, she looked like exactly what she appeared to be. A quiet woman who worked at a community center and minded her own business. But Arya could see that her clean record was making him suspicious rather than reassuring him. In his mind, everyone had something to hide. The fact that he couldn't find anything on her was proof that she was hiding something big. The harassment escalated beyond traffic stops. She started getting noise complaints called in about her apartment, even when she was being perfectly quiet. Her landlord mentioned that police had been asking questions about her, claiming they were investigating reports of suspicious activity. When she went for her morning runs, Castellanos would drive beside her slowly, just close enough to make her uncomfortable. He never did anything she could file an official complaint about, but the message was clear. He was watching her, and he wanted her to know it. The worst part was how isolated it made her feel. Her friends started asking questions about why she kept getting pulled over. Some of them suggested she must be doing something wrong, because police don't just harass innocent people for no reason. Arya knew better. She'd seen enough of the world to know that power could corrupt, and that some people would abuse their authority just because they could. But explaining that to people who had never experienced it was nearly impossible. She thought about filing a complaint with the police department, but she knew how that would go. It would be her word against a decorated officer's. She had no witnesses to most of the incidents, and the few people who had seen the traffic stops would probably side with the police. Instead, she decided to be patient. Every good military operation required careful planning and the right timing. She would gather her evidence, document everything, and wait for Castellanos to make a mistake big enough that even his fellow officers couldn't ignore it. She had learned long ago that the best way to defeat an enemy was to let them defeat themselves. Castellanos was angry, frustrated, and getting sloppy. Eventually, that would work in her favor. But as she watched him drive past her apartment building for the third time that week, Arya wondered just how far he was willing to go. And more importantly, she wondered what he would do when he finally realized that she wasn't going to be intimidated into backing down. Some people thought that silence meant weakness. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The call came on a Tuesday morning. The domestic violence case was being reopened. New evidence had surfaced that contradicted Officer Castellanos' original testimony, and the victim's lawyer wanted Arya to testify about what she had witnessed that night. Arya agreed immediately. She knew this was the right thing to do, but she also knew it would make Castellanos desperate. Desperate people did dangerous things. She was right to be worried. That same afternoon, she was driving home from the community center when the familiar red and blue lights appeared behind her. But this time felt different. Castellanos wasn't alone. A second patrol car followed close behind. Arya pulled over in a well-lit parking lot near a busy shopping center. She wanted witnesses if things went wrong. Her hands were steady on the wheel, but her mind was racing through possibilities. Castellanos approached her window with a confidence she hadn't seen before. His partner, a younger officer named Rodriguez, stayed back by the patrol cars but kept his hand near his weapon. "Tiro." "Out of the vehicle," Castellanos ordered without any of his usual fake politeness. "May I ask why I'm being stopped?" Arya asked, though she kept her voice calm and respectful. "Just step out of the car." "Now." Arya complied slowly, keeping her hands visible. Years of training had taught her to read situations, and this one was about to go very bad very quickly. "Turn around and place your hands on the vehicle," Castellanos commanded. As Arya turned, she caught sight of something that made her blood run cold. Castellanos was pulling something from his pocket, a small plastic bag that definitely hadn't been there when he first approached her car. "Well, well," he said loudly, making sure his voice carried to the other officer and any bystanders. "What do we have here?" He reached into her car through the open driver's side door and emerged holding the plastic bag. Even from her position against the car, Arya could see what was inside, a small amount of white powder and what looked like a glass pipe. "Found this under your seat," he announced. "Looks like our concerned citizen isn't as clean as she pretends to be." Arya's heart pounded, but she forced herself to stay calm. "That's not mine. I've never seen that before in my life." "That's what they all say," Rodriguez called out from behind them. He sounded uncomfortable, but not uncomfortable enough to question his senior officer. Castellanos roughly pulled Arya's arms behind her back and snapped on handcuffs. They were too tight, cutting into her wrists, but she didn't complain. She knew anything she said would only make things worse. "You have the right to remain silent," he began. But his tone made it clear this was just a formality. He was enjoying this too much. As they drove to the station, Arya stared out the window and tried to process what had just happened. She'd been framed, actually framed like something out of a movie. But this wasn't entertainment. This was her life falling apart in real time. At the police station, things got worse. Castellanos made sure she was processed by officers who seemed to share his attitude. They accidentally bumped into her while walking her through the booking process. They made her wait in uncomfortable positions longer than necessary. They asked the same questions over and over, trying to trip her up. During the fingerprinting, the officer pressed her fingers down harder than needed, leaving ink stains on her hands that would take days to wash off completely. When they took her, mugshot, they made her stand under harsh lights that made her look exhausted and guilty. Phone call, one of the officers finally said, pushing her toward a payphone that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. Arya called the only lawyer she knew, the same one representing the domestic violence victim. Attorney Johnson listened quietly as Arya explained what had happened. "Don't say anything else to anyone," Johnson warned. "I'll be there as soon as possible, but it might take a few hours to arrange bail." Those few hours felt like days. Arya was placed in a holding cell with 3 other women. One was clearly having withdrawal symptoms and couldn't stop shaking. Another kept muttering to herself about conspiracy theories. The third just stared at the wall with dead eyes. The cell smelled like disinfectant and despair. The bench was metal and uncomfortable, designed to make sitting or lying down as unpleasant as possible. The single toilet had no privacy screen, and the fluorescent lights never turned off. But Arya had endured worse conditions during her military service. She used the time to think, to plan, and to observe. She noticed which officers seemed sympathetic, and which ones appeared to be part of Castellanos' circle. She memorized shift changes and security camera locations. She listened to conversations and picked up information about how evidence was handled and stored. Most importantly, she thought about timing. The domestic violence case retrial was scheduled for next week. Castellanos had moved against her now because he was running out of time. His previous perjury was about to be exposed, and he needed her discredited before she could testify. It was actually a smart move, she had to admit. Who would believe the testimony of someone arrested on drug charges? Even if the charges were eventually dropped, the damage to her credibility would be done. When Attorney Johnson finally arrived, she looked grim. "The evidence against you is thin," she said quietly in the consultation room. "But the system tends to believe police officers over defendants. We're going to have to fight this carefully." "How long before I can get out of here?" Arya asked. "Bail hearing is tomorrow morning." "I'll argue for release on your own recognizance since you have no prior record, but given the charges..." Johnson shook her head. "Drug possession with intent to distribute carries serious penalties." "Intent to distribute?" Arya felt her stomach drop. "They're claiming the amount and the presence of paraphernalia suggests you were dealing, not just using. It's a felony charge." That night in the cell, Arya lay on the thin mattress and stared at the ceiling. She thought about all the missions she'd completed successfully, all the dangerous situations she'd navigated, all the impossible odds she'd overcome. And now she was being taken down by one corrupt cop with a planted baggie. But as she lay there, something shifted in her mind. This wasn't just about her anymore. If Castellanos was willing to frame her, how many other people had he done this to? How many innocent people were sitting in cells right now because they had crossed him? She thought about the domestic violence victim who was depending on her testimony. She thought about other women who might become targets of Castellanos' abuse of power. She thought about the community she'd sworn to protect, first as a soldier and now as a civilian. By morning, Arya had made a decision. She wasn't going to just defend herself against these charges. She was going to take Castellanos down completely, but she would have to be smarter than him, more patient than him, and more determined than him. The bail hearing went better than expected. Johnson's arguments were persuasive, and the judge seemed skeptical of some details in the arrest report. Arya was released on bail with the condition that she stay away from the domestic violence case. But as she walked out of the courthouse, she saw Castellanos waiting by his patrol car in the parking lot. He wasn't even trying to hide the satisfaction on his face. "This is just the beginning," he called out as she passed. "You should have minded your own business." Arya didn't respond. She just kept walking. But inside, she was already planning her next move. Castellanos thought he had won, but he had no idea who he was really dealing with. The hunt was about to begin. The first thing Aria did after getting out on bail was buy a new phone. If Castellanos was willing to frame her, he might be tracking her communications too. She paid cash and set it up under a different name. The second thing she did was start hunting. Aria had learned long ago that every enemy had weaknesses. You just had to know where to look. Castellanos thought he was untouchable because he wore a badge, but badges didn't make people invisible. They just made them careless. She started with public records, property ownership, vehicle registrations, court filings, all available to anyone who knew where to look. Within 2 days, she had a complete picture of Castellanos' life outside the police force. He owned a house in an expensive neighborhood that seemed beyond what a patrol officer should be able to afford. He drove a brand new truck that cost more than most people made in a year. He belonged to an exclusive golf club with membership fees that raised serious questions about his income sources. But the most interesting discovery was his social media presence. Castellanos apparently thought privacy settings were optional. His posts showed expensive vacations, designer clothes, and nights out at high-end restaurants, all on a cop's salary. Even more revealing were the people he associated with. Photo after photo showed him with known criminals, guys who had been arrested for drug dealing, money laundering, and worse. The kind of people an honest police officer should be arresting, not partying with. Aria printed everything and organized it in a folder that grew thicker each day, but she needed more than suspicious social media posts. She needed proof of actual crimes. That's when she decided to do what she did best: surveillance. Every military operation started with reconnaissance. You learned your target's patterns, identified their vulnerabilities, and waited for the right moment to strike. Castellanos had no idea he was being watched by someone who had spent years perfecting the art of staying invisible. She borrowed a friend's car and changed her appearance. A different hairstyle, glasses instead of contacts, and clothes that made her look like a completely different person. Then she began following Castellanos during his off-duty hours. The first week revealed nothing unusual. He went to work, came home, went to the gym, watched TV. But Aria was patient. She knew that criminals eventually got comfortable and made mistakes. On the second Tuesday of her surveillance, Castellanos drove to a warehouse district on the wrong side of town. He parked behind a building and waited. 20 minutes later, a black SUV pulled up beside him. Aria watched through binoculars as Castellanos got out of his car and approached the SUV. A man she recognized from his social media photos handed him a thick envelope. In return, Castellanos gave the man what looked like a small package. The meeting lasted less than 5 minutes, but Aria captured it all on video using a camera with a powerful zoom lens. She made sure to get clear shots of both men, their vehicles, and the license plates. Over the next month, she documented 6 more similar meetings. Always the same location, always the same routine. Castellanos was clearly running some kind of side business, and based on the secrecy and location, it wasn't legal. But the real breakthrough came when she decided to investigate the domestic violence case more thoroughly. Attorney Johnson had mentioned that new evidence had surfaced, but she hadn't explained what that evidence was. Aria spent an afternoon at the courthouse, reviewing public records and talking to clerks who knew the case. What she discovered made her blood boil. There had been other witnesses to the domestic violence incident. 3 people had called 911 that night, reporting the same address and describing the same situation, but only one of those calls was mentioned in the police report, the one that supported Castellanos' version of events. The other 2 callers had described seeing the victim being beaten by her boyfriend while Castellanos stood nearby and did nothing. One caller specifically mentioned hearing Castellanos tell the boyfriend to keep it down, but never attempting to stop the assault. Even worse, one of those missing witnesses had tried to follow up with the police department. She'd called several times asking about giving a statement, but was told her testimony wasn't needed. When she persisted, she started receiving the same kind of harassment that Aria had experienced: traffic stops for minor violations, police showing up at her workplace asking questions, anonymous complaints about noise and suspicious activity at her apartment. The woman eventually stopped calling and moved to another city. Arya realized she wasn't Castellanos' first victim. He had a system for silencing people who threatened to expose his corruption. The frame-up was just his latest escalation. She needed help, but she couldn't trust the local police department. Too many officers seemed to be either part of the corruption or too scared to speak up against it. She needed someone from outside the system. That's when she remembered Detective Williams from the county sheriff's department. She'd met him during a community safety meeting months earlier, and he'd seemed genuinely committed to fighting corruption. More importantly, he worked for a different agency that might be willing to investigate local police misconduct. The meeting took place in a diner 40 miles outside the city. Williams listened quietly as Arya laid out everything she'd disco. Their pressure, gathering intelligence, building your case methodically. You used your training well. Thank you, sir. But how did you know to come here? Rodriguez smiled. Detective Williams reached out to us last week. Once we learned what was happening, we couldn't let it stand. No one harasses our people without consequences. Outside the courthouse, Detective Williams was waiting with more details. The federal charges are just the beginning, he told Arya. We found evidence linking Castellanos to a drug trafficking ring that's been operating for 2 years. His police badge gave them protection and inside information about investigations. What about the other victims? Arya asked. We're reviewing every case he's been involved with. At least a dozen people are going to have their charges thrown out, and several will probably file civil rights lawsuits. You opened the door for all of them. Attorney Johnson joined them on the courthouse steps. Patricia wanted me to thank you, she said to Arya. She said knowing you were fighting for her gave her courage to keep going. Over the next few weeks, the story exploded across local and national media. Decorated Navy SEAL exposes police corruption became a headline that appeared everywhere. Arya found herself thrust into a spotlight she'd never wanted, but she handled it with the same calm professionalism she'd shown throughout the ordeal. The police department launched a full internal investigation and found that Castellanos hadn't been working alone. 3 other officers were arrested, and the entire narcotics unit was disbanded. The chief of police resigned in disgrace. Castellanos himself was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to avoid even more serious charges. His expensive house and vehicles were seized as proceeds of criminal activity. But for Arya, the real victory came 6 months later when she received a letter from Patricia. She had rebuilt her life, started therapy, and was working as an advocate for other domestic violence survivors. You showed me that it's possible to fight back, Patricia wrote. You proved that bullies can be beaten, even when they wear badges. Thank you for not giving up. Arya kept that letter in a frame on her desk at the community center, where she continued teaching self-defense classes. But now those classes included something new: sessions on knowing your rights during police encounters and how to document harassment. She'd learned that her real mission hadn't ended when she left the military. It had just changed locations. There were still people who needed protection, still bullies who needed to be stopped, still fights worth fighting. And Arya Thompson, former Navy SEAL, was ready for whatever came next.